see nobody this fly. It's like we back in school again. Now come on, children, don't spell it F-L-Y. You ain't never seen nobody this fly. Yeah. And I'm gone. I deserve to be with somebody as fly as me. Somebody this fly.
Hi, everyone. Happy Tuesday. We're really excited to have you share space and community with us today. We're going to go ahead and get started with a couple introductions, and then we'll jump into our land acknowledgement. I'll start first. My name is Eunice. I teach 7th and 8th grade, and I am part of the LESMC team. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. I'll hand it off to Maureen.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Maureen Texan. I teach 2nd grade at Alvarado Elementary School here in Union City. I'm also the co-founder of our Social Justice Academy, the first one in our district for elementary school. Just happy to have you here.
And then Samia, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, all. I'm Samia Showman. I oversee the implementation of ethnic studies in my school district. I work for the San Mateo Union High School District, longtime social science teacher as well, and really glad to be in community with you all tonight.
Danny?
Half a day, everyone. My name is Danny Bloss, and I am a 7th and 8th grade teacher in San Diego Unified and also a member of the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Team. Thanks for being here.
And Tracy.
Great, thanks, Eunice. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tracy Noriega, co-lead for Chapter 4, the Asian American Pacific Islander Studies, with Eunice here as part of Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Coalition. And I also serve the students of San Lorenzo Unified School District as the Superintendent of Educational Services. Thank you so much all for joining us.
Yeah, I imagine many of us are finishing up our school year, so thank you for being here. We're going to jump into our land acknowledgement. And so Tracy and I are going to share where we're teaching or living, and then Tracy's going to share a little bit about some examples of how her district is trying to do land acknowledgements. So for myself, I live and teach in a Hashiman/Tongva land. And Tracy?
Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you from occupied Ohlone territory. San Lorenzo Unified actually sits on Muwekma Ohlone territory. And one of the things that we do in San Lorenzo Unified School District to make the land acknowledgement come alive, we do read our land acknowledgement at our board meetings and the majority of meetings that we hold. But to try and make it come alive, a number of us pay into the Shumi land tax with the Sogorea land trust. Another aspect is that we are forming a Native American Indian family committee this coming year with a kickoff in August with a number of families. So I ask you to put your names in the chat, introduce yourselves, and
Violet.
Yeah, so we're a cozy group. So take a moment to go ahead and share your name in the chat, as well as what land you are coming from, and then we'll get started in a little bit.
Thank you all. for continue chatting in your introductions, where you're coming from, your name, and what occupied land you're Zooming from. We'd like to take a moment, like we do in all of our institutes, and acknowledge an ancestor, right? And bring that inspiration into our space. Tonight, I'm honored to be able to acknowledge Shireen Abu Akleh, who's a Palestinian American journalist who was recently killed as she was reporting on what was happening in the areas around Jenin, Palestine. She worked for Al Jazeera for 25 years. For us Palestinians and the broader Arab community, Shireen was a heroine, an inspiration, and a model for what we Palestinians consider is samud, which in Arabic means steadfastness, right? Staying on our land and being dedicated to telling our story. She certainly was dedicated to bringing the voice of what was happening to Palestinians and Palestine to the mainstream, public, stories that are not often told or don't often get heard. And she died doing what she loved to do the most, what she dedicated her life to. It was a tragedy and left a lot of people kind of surprised and reeling. In particular, she's also a woman in a field where we don't see a lot of Palestinian Arab women in. So we want to take a minute to bring Shireen and her spirit and her fighting, her fighting spirit and the resistance that she's contributed to Palestine into our space this evening.
Thank you, Samia, for that wonderful tribute. Well, again, thank you everyone for joining us today on this late afternoon. This is what we're going to get into today. As we move on with our agenda today, we'll jump into a community builder right after this, talk about what is ethnic studies, talk a little bit about multicultural education, and building on top of that to get to ethnic studies. We'll also bring you through not just learning the history of the term AAPI, but also involving you and as part of the lesson, as this one of the things that we definitely want to showcase as we end Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month today. That includes showcasing a little bit of our lesson plan template, and then showcasing some more lessons for all of you, hopefully to inspire you and provide some support for everyone as you build your ethnic studies programs. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Maureen for our community builder.
All right. So for our community builder today, what we're going to do is we are going to go into breakout rooms of about 3 or 4. We are going to first share your name. And then what we want to do is we want you to share your favorite Asian American Pacific Islander story growing up, or an AAPI story that you learned recently, or even an AAPI book that's on your to-read list. We probably have long lists of those. And what we're going to talk about is, what do you notice about what stories are represented and what stories are missing? So I'll just go ahead and start with an example from me. Again, my name is Maureen Texon. My favorite book that I have just picked up for my classroom actually this year is this book that's called, oh, you can't see it. It's called When Lola Visits. And it's a great picture book. A lot more BIPOC authors are coming out with books that are way more diverse and great for our classroom. But this book just reminds me of my experience growing up because my grandparents, my Lolo, my Lola, would always travel back and forth from the Philippines. They would come and visit. My parents were one of the first to immigrate to the US. So they would always, my grandparents would always come back and forth. So this is such a heartwarming story because it just talks about how her Lola always comes and visits her and then goes back to the Philippines. But it's great to see characters who are Filipino that look like me because as you probably all know, like growing up, I didn't see any of that. So this is my favorite book right now for elementary when Lola visits. Are we ready with breakout rooms?
Yes, I can open up breakout rooms for you. Do you want is 3 to 4 participants okay? Yeah.
Yep.
They should be open. Thank you, Lupe.
Okay, thank you.
You should be able to see. I'll time it for about 5 minutes.
Do you mind putting music just so that our live video has a little bit of something going on?
Turned up.
Hola, 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 ¿Cómo están? Mapuche. ¿Cómo están? Mapuche. Hola, 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 ¿Cómo están? Mapuche. ¿Cómo están? Mapuche. Damn. Girl, you gotta work it, make sure it's worth it. Go rock that body, make sure it's perfect. Go ahead and twerk it, do it with purpose. Make me say, oh God, like a Sunday service.
I like the way you do it, the way you break it down, make me wanna go pursue it. Sa iyong galaw, hindi ko matiis na di mapatanaw. I like the way you drop it, right now your booty is my number one topic. Ako'y natulala, para bang nagayuma sa katawan mo maganda. I like the way you shake it. Baby, if you're hot, why don't you go and get naked? I like the way you jiggle. Wiggle and wiggle and wiggle and wiggle.
Hola, 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 ¿Cómo están? Mapuche. ¿Cómo están? Mapuche. Hola, 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 ¿Cómo están? Mapuche. ¿Cómo están? Mapuche.
Shake it all around. No, we ain't tripping, got enough to go around. Car European in the crib on the mount. Kept it 1,000 with $1 million sound. You know,
thick. Go rock that body, make sure it's perfect. Go ahead and twerk it, do it with purpose. Make me say, oh God, like a Sunday service.
I like the way you serve it. Girl, take my money cause you know you deserve it. Galing mo magdala. Talbog lahat sila, pwede talaga. Baby, those real. I don't give a fuck, there's a love how they feel. Pinagawa pa yan. Kung ano man gusto ko pa rin yan. I like the way you say it. Sa iyong mga bulong lalo pang napapaakit. I like the way you jiggle. Wiggle and wiggle and wiggle and wiggle. Hola, hola, eh.
Hola, hola, eh.
Como están?
Mapute,
Como están?
mapute.
Hola, hola, eh.
Hola, hola, eh.
Como están?
Mapute,
Como están?
mapute. Mapute. Oh my, where did the weekend go? Oh man, Monday snuck up so fast. No one keeps me in the loop when I get back. Guess it's up to me to stay in the loop. Oh, staying in the loop, staying in the loop, staying in the loop, staying in the loop, yeah, staying in the loop, staying in the
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you got to share a number of your stories and hopefully got to add some more to your lists. So now we're going to get on to what is ethnic studies?
Thank you. Is this her? Nope. Is this mine? Yes, it is. So I'll start. We're going to quickly review what is ethnic studies just to ground us this evening in terms of the lessons we have to share. But really, ethnic studies is what grounds us in our histories and the way they've been impacted by global imperialism, colonialism, settlement, and white supremacy, right? Which unfortunately has been the stories not told and the stories not at the center. And ethnic studies really is about us reclaiming our histories, reclaiming our indigeneity, and really using that understanding, right, to know ourselves. Because if we don't know where we came from and what we've been through and what we've struggled for, right, we end up in a place where our history, ourselves, our identities are lost in what was, and I feel like is now shifting. But what was, at least when I was growing up, a very Eurocentric centered curriculum through all of the core.
So just naming some more points about ethnic studies, really what we also want to remember is ethnic studies is also about the intentional advocacy, right? Solidarity, international liberation, and unity. They're both practices and principles. The theories and practices of organizing to make sure that we eliminate racism. The actual act of eliminating racism and white supremacy and other forms of oppression is very important within ethnic studies, and making sure that our practices are anti-racist, that our pedagogy is centered in that. We have a really important job of making sure that we're critically responsive and that we're doing critically pedagogical practices. So really, it's studying the ethnic studies, but also making sure that we're advocates. And one simple way that I tell my kids all the time is, we always need to stand on the side of justice, even at a second grade level. They can understand that. And we can't be neutral as teachers, we can't be neutral as students, we can't be neutral as just generally as people. So always making sure that we're advocating to eliminate racism and white supremacy is super important in ethnic studies.
Yeah, so jumping off of that, some pedagogical moves in the classroom include abolitionist teaching, and then one practical project or activity you could do with your students is YPAR, so youth participatory action research projects, and thinking about how we can encourage young people to take their knowledge and do something with their knowledge to be engaged with their community. And then last but not least, as teachers, we want to really emphasize that we are always humanizing our students, ourselves and our students as we learn in community. And a key part of ethnic studies is that collectively, ourselves included with the students, is that we're working towards healing in community.
I'll take the next slide. Multiculturalism versus ethnic studies. And on the next slide there we go. That multicultural education, multicultural studies is inclusive of all the marginalized communities, and it may incorporate Black, Indigenous, and people of color perspective into their curriculum. And the difference between multicultural studies and ethnic studies is that ethnic studies centers racialized communities, and in particular, Asian American studies, Arab American studies, Chicanx studies, Latinx studies, African American studies, American Indian and Native American, and Pacific Islanders as well. And so it's self-determination, deconstruction, and voice. It's about the way you think about the world, content and experiences of Native and people of color. So it's focused on 4 major disciplines in the university area. And so that is the difference between ethnic studies and multicultural studies.
A couple other things for multicultural studies. One theme is using multiple perspectives and hearing from different voices and communities, and pushing this idea of tolerance and acceptance. But ethnic studies, we want to push it even further, and not just having multiple perspectives, but having counter narratives that speak against dominant narratives in our culture. And again, like I mentioned earlier, pushing towards healing and hope and working in solidarity with each other. And so really ethnic studies is about what does it look like to teach in liberatory ways, and in ways that help students to interrogate power in our society.
So a few more points to make. And really the question is like, why this whole conversation about multicultural studies and now pushing into ethnic studies? I think a number of years ago, 30 something years ago, we dipped our tippy toes into the water, right, with multicultural education. And that was the big buzzword. And it looked like, again, making sure that we had posters on the wall that looked like our students, books that reflected them, and just within this last few years, there's been a number of books, as Maureen has said, that definitely reflect who we are as BIPOC folks and our stories, right, and accurate stories, not any negative stereotyping or perpetuating, right, these particular myths about people. So really, the question is like, well, what do we do? We started there, and now we're continuing to push. So just a few more things to think about, because multicultural education is definitely a basis for things, for ethnic studies in a way. And I'll say a little bit more about that before I close. But if we think about multicultural studies in the aspect of global, right, we're thinking about the whole world. Whereas in ethnic studies, we want to become internationalists. We really, and we want to support countries in working with each other. And in solidarity, right? So this whole aspect of world peace, if you will, is global, but then together as countries, how do we support each other? We think of the history of the United States of America, right? If you are not Native, you are an immigrant to this space. So, how do we take all of that into account? Allyship was a start, right? Where you can walk alongside me and hopefully have my back, and sometimes way back. But now it's about being co-conspirators, doing this work alongside me, with me, and maybe sometimes going out in front because you have privilege and power in many ways, right? So this is really an aspect for our our white adjacent folks, our white co-conspirators, right? Not just moving from, not just being allies, but actually being co-conspirators in that work. Starting out as anti-bias, but really moving into anti-racist, but then situated in one of the 4 core disciplines that we talked about. So again, multicultural education, again, thinking everybody, but then ethnic studies, specifically these 4 core disciplines that have been left out for a number of years. And it is one of the reasons why we are pushing today. Another thing I will add before I turn it over to our next, Dr. Teresa Montaño, who has written this framework. She's also said before, multicultural education is not ethnic studies. Anti-racist education is not ethnic studies. Social justice education is not ethnic studies, but ethnic studies encompasses all of that. So now let's look at the structure of our lessons. Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Coalition, we actually started out as a number of folks who came together to write curriculum, right? Liberated curriculum, a curriculum that we felt that was more authentic. If you understand the history of how we all came together, you may understand a little bit more. And it really was on the heels of when the state brought together a committee of folks to write curriculum, but then there was so much pushback from folks that didn't agree with some of the things that were in there. A number of those people, of those amazing people, came together, and some of us joined in to create this curriculum for folks. We've been supporting a number of districts within the last year or so, and continue to support districts with writing their curriculum. And the one thing I will say is that while these are sample lessons, every ethnic studies lesson is going to be different, because you want to be able to situate it in your community. AAPI, an Asian American Pacific Islander class is going to look different in San Francisco. It's going to look different down the way in Oakland. It's going to look different in, parts of Los Angeles, and it's going to look different in San Diego Unified, right? So taking into account your context, these lessons are starting points, but you want to be able to think about who is in your classroom. So Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, we've formulated ourselves into various chapters. As you can see, we have the 4 core disciplines here: our Black Studies, our Chicano, Chicanx, Latina, Latino, Latinx studies, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Arab American studies, American Indian and Native studies. But we also added a chapter for Introduction to Ethnic Studies and then Comparative Ethnic Studies. And each of those chapters includes these particular units: the self, stories, systems, social movements, and solidarity. So the lessons that we will be showcasing today and involving you in this learning experience come from these particular units within the AAPI chapter. The lesson plan template includes all of these. We talk about our particular rituals. So we always have our land acknowledgement, our ancestor acknowledgement. Those are our cultural rituals, including a cultural energizer, that community builder. We always discuss critical concepts. So a few of the concepts that you'll see today are concepts like empowerment, solidarity, decolonialization, those counter narratives that we want to be able to build from. Here, community collaboration and critical cultural production is a must. So a lot of these lessons, as we go through the lessons, you will see that, that students are making meaning. They are looking at various resources, primary sources. They're also utilizing their own particular knowledge, because we think about Terra Yoso and community cultural wealth and that aspect. So today, when we're talking about resistance and joy, we want to be able to talk about those movements that inspire us, and all of the amazing wealth that this community, the AAPI community, brings to the table. Conclusive dialogue is a one way where we wrap things up. It's an assessment piece, if you will, but again, it acknowledges that that knowledge is built by our students, right? They are the creators of knowledge. They're not necessarily told what to think. They get to create that knowledge by the studies and of course with each other. So kind of this entryway that we think about when we're creating lessons, who is the audience, right? So is it predominantly, BIPOC students? Is it more homogeneous? Again, thinking about who you have in your classroom and the narratives that you present them. So if it's again, Asian American studies, if it's predominantly, if you have a classroom full of predominantly Asian students, what part of the diaspora are the students coming from, right? What is their particular experience? And then how do you draw out that knowledge from them, right? Because again, these lessons have to be about them. The concepts of community cultural wealth is foundational. The content, one of the lessons that we'll be going through is the origins of the label Asian American. So this was an organizer to kind of think about how we would jump into that lesson. So let me backtrack a little bit, right? Who is your audience? Meaning, who are your students that are in your classroom? What is it that you know about them? What is the wealth that they bring? Who is, this particular lesson talking about? And again, how do you make those connections from the intent of the lesson to the students that you have in your classroom? Building on the community cultural wealth, again, drawing on the knowledge that they bring and building off of that. This is the content. Miss Eunice will be going through the history of the term AAPI. The concepts that you'll experience today are about solidarity and empowerment, and I'm sure you'll find a few more. And this lesson is really targeted to high school, 9th through 12th grade. So with that, I will turn it over to Eunice.
Thanks, Tracy. So what we're going to do for the rest of our evening, I'm going to start us off with this lesson. It's a couple select slides from this lesson, which Kathleen and I actually made together, she's in our audience today. So hi, Kathleen. After I go, I'll take us to about 6:15 or so. We'll take a break, and then after break, we have the 3 remaining sample lessons. So the lesson that Kathleen and I created is called The Origins of the Label Asian American. So this goes into our self unit, the first chapter of our first unit of our chapter. And as we were creating it, we were really thinking about like, where does this term come from? And like, who does it serve and who does it not serve? Right. So our essential question on our next slide is, how can names and labels, there you go, be empowering, and or how can names or labels be limiting? And the reason we thought about this question is because the language of race is fluid. It changes over time as we try to make sense of the implications of the language that we choose to use for ourselves. And so what purpose do these identities and these labels accomplish, and who's harmed by certain labels? And so basically, we want to use this question to critically interrogate the label Asian American, and subsequently, it can have parallel implications in other communities of colors as well. So it can be readily applicable to a wide swath of students. Like we mentioned earlier, ethnic studies is for everyone. And so we want to help students challenge how they might think of themselves and or of other students, and to bring to light the implications of some labels that we use today. So the first activity we have, our opener activity, is a couple images. I'm only going to show you one, but you'll have access to the other slides. So this is one of the images that we'll share with the students first and have them go through it. I see, I think it means, I wonder what it means. And what you'll see on the back of this man's jacket, right, it says he is pleading to be identified as Chinese and not as Japanese. So on the next slide, we have some explanations for the different images that in this opener activity. And I just highlighted a piece of on the right-hand side. So the context for this image is that there was a shift in white America's perceptions of Chinese Americans. And the reason is because of World War II, right? There is yellow hysteria, yellow peril, and folks didn't want to be identified as Japanese. So on the next slide, we have a quote from Professor Daryl Maeda. He says, if you were to ask most people at this time period who are Asian American that we would consider today, describe your race or ethnicity, they would say, I'm Japanese, or I'm Thai, or Cambodian, or Filipino. The term Asian American did not exist. We didn't use it before. And like I mentioned, the reason this is because of World War II, the yellow peril hysteria. So on the next slide, you'll see, I believe this, I forgot that this is from the Life magazine article. And so if you zoom in, you'll see these really awful, dehumanizing labels to describe how to differentiate different Asians, people from different Asian communities. So it's hard to read, so I transcribed it for you. So for example, parchment yellow complexion describes the eye fold, higher bridge, nose bridge, rosy cheeks, etc. So this just kind of hopes to show students kind of the racial environment of that time, how Asian individuals were being racialized at this time. So the next slide is, actually, I think could you update the slide, Tracy, if you exit and then reload it? Okay, cool. Sorry, I think I updated the quote. So this is a quote from a book called American History Unbound by scholar Gary Okihiro. And it really, for me, perfectly summarizes what we want the students to leave with from this lesson. So the term Asian American was invented in the late 1960s, and the reason was explicitly for political solidarity and mobilization. At this time, remember, they didn't consider themselves Asian Americans, and so they decided that because of the shared history of Orientalism and racialization and oppression that united them, they could use this term strategically to counter white supremacy and to organize against white supremacy. And so Gary references the scholar Gayatri Spivak, who has the term strategic essentialism. And so basically readers should think of categories like Asian American or AAPI, right, as temporary terms in the struggle against oppression. It has a context, it is relational, and it's not permanent, right? It changes over time. So we have an article for students. It's from NBC. It's pretty good. It goes through the history of where the term Asian American comes from, so you'll have access to this article. But the main points on the next slide are that it basically is, one, a self-chosen identifier during the 60s. It was inspired by the Black Power movement and the anti-war movement, committed explicitly to anti-racism and anti-imperialism. And I think this is a quote from the article: we have to work together to fight for social justice and equality, not only for ourselves, but for all the people around us. So when I learned this term, the history of this term in college, it was incredibly empowering, because part of this, what's attached to this term, Asian American, is that Asian Americans are apolitical or not involved in politics, right? And so when I learned this history, it was really healing for me. So what I want to do, and for a couple minutes, our next activity for students is actually a mixer activity. And what Kathleen and I did was that we read through the oral histories of the organizers who came up with the term Asian American, and compiled them into a mixer. There is a longer version, but I'm just going to give you a shorter version, so I'll put it in the chat right now. And what I'm going to ask you to do, there are 6 different people organizers in the slides. So we have Vicky, Steve, Bruce, Harvey, Jeffrey, and Keith. So once you're in those slides, go ahead and you can choose any one of them to read. I'll give you a couple minutes. And Tracy, if you go back to the previous slide, I have some questions for everyone. So as you're reading, think about what do you hear from these people's immigration stories, and why was the Asian American label so empowering for these activists? And then lastly, to predict, why might the Asian American label be limiting? So we're at 6:11, so I know it might be a little bit quick, But let's do 2 minutes or so of reading. You can skim, and then if you could, once you're done, you can feel free to share some thoughts in the chat, and then we'll move on from there. So we'll go to maybe 6:13, give you some time to choose one, read it, and then share some thoughts in the chat. Okay, so I know that was super quick, but if anyone is ready, if you could share some thoughts in the chat. What did you notice about their immigration story? What did the Asian American label mean to them? And if you want to predict why it might be limiting in the upcoming years after the 60s. Okay, thank you, Samia. So let's see. So from Harvey Dong, grew up reading the Black Panther newspaper, started going to AAPA meetings, was taught basic things about racism, that we need to know our history, our identity, about imperialism. And it takes individuals and people sharing, finding connected experiences, finding common ground. Vicky Wong connects to the civil rights movement, exercising self-determination. Yeah, it all speaks to authentic ethnic studies, the heart of ethnic studies, and knowing ourselves and knowing our history. And we have a prediction from Crystal, limiting because it lumps all Asians together, which strips away each unique culture, language. Perfect, thank you. So those slides are for you. There's also, when you get the slides, there's a link to the longer biographies. So let me move us because we're a little bit behind. So perfectly, as Crystal said, this term is limiting, right? It has a really powerful and healing history and is also limiting. So in the next couple slides, so UCSD has a great primer for the alphabet soup that is API MEDA. So if this is helpful for students, you can have them go through after this term Asian American was termed, slowly and gradually more and more groups started being added to this group. But like Crystal said, the different groups, different communities have different racialized experiences and different histories. And so we want to think about like, what does this term do for our communities if we are not using it in a critical way? So yeah, so there's a provided graphic organizer for you. So often when we hear the term Asian American, we folks have like a stereotype that Asians, so this chart seems to argue that Asians have the highest income if we divide by race. But really, when we look closer, this is a result of the model minority myth that came about in the 60s during the civil rights movement. It was intentionally built and created to be anti-Black and to denigrate Black and Brown communities who were fighting for civil rights and who were politically involved. So in the next slide, this is just a couple screenshots from the very newspaper article that created the model minority myth. I believe this is from the US News and World Report. I just circled some words for you to look through with your students. But as you can see from the next slide, that when you disaggregate the different income from the different groups, the AAPI group has extreme disparity in terms of income. So it's quite problematic to use, just to use this umbrella term and assume that, you know, all Asian Americans or everyone in this group, this racialized group, is doing fine economically, when really the story is much more complex than that. So there's a couple questions for you to use with your students if helpful, and I will leave you with the lesson takeaways. So lesson takeaways is that this term came about as a result of analysis of oppression, and it was used to be strategic, right, to organize against oppression. It was originally Pan-Asian, but it was used to advocate for on behalf of their needs, but they realized over time that it wasn't encompassing of everyone, and so they wanted to think more critically about why this term is limiting. So we wanted to start off with this lesson because just to ground us in some theory around when we think about the AAPI community, we want to recognize, like, one, yes, this term came from a really powerful history, and we want to honor that. And as we think about how to honor the multiplicity of stories that we have in our community, how can we do that in a way that's humanizing to every group and in a way that doesn't essentialize them? So we're going to take a 5-minute break. After break, we'll jump into different lessons, some of which are for elementary and some of which are for middle school and high school.
St. Louis to New Orleans, someone take me off my feet. Rode horseback down the Mississippi, someone gotta keep me in the loop, please.
Då kommer det inrikta sig på optimeringar.
Home. They say it's where the heart is. They also say it's wherever you make it. They don't say it's where you unload your stuff, get tired halfway through unpacking, use some boxes as furniture, realize your oven mitt's in a box that doubles as a nightstand, don't want to buy a new nightstand, and use a towel as an oven mitt instead. But no matter where you call home, Geico makes it easy to bundle and save on renters and car insurance. Easier than grabbing a piping hot pan with a towel that's a bit too thin and trying to quickly get it to the counter. Ooh, hot, 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 hot.
Maybe into punk rock, soft rock, or classic rock, R&B, hip hop, or house, country, techno, or techno country. But no matter what kind of music you listen to, here's something else you should hear. Please consider getting vaccinated. Talk to your pharmacist today about Comirnaty, COVID-19 vaccine mRNA. This message brought to you by BioNTech and Pfizer.
Whew, what a vibe. Yo,
Love that song.
I love how the four members all sound so different.
I'm Kathleen Scher.
And I'm Allison Toy. On our show Lion Share, we get to feature full songs alongside their stories when we highlight Asian artists every week in our Music Plus Talk Show, a new type of show created with Spotify's free podcasting platform, Anchor.
With Anchor, you can add any Spotify song into your episodes and combine them with talk segments by you to create a Music Plus Talk Show.
Want to make your own? It's easy. All you have to do is head to anchor.fm/musicplustalk and download the Anchor app.
I still remember 3rd of December, me in your sweater. You said it looked better on me than it did you. Only if you knew how much I liked you. But I watch your eyes as she walks by. What is
Right, everyone, welcome back. Welcome. I hope you got a chance to get some water, take a little bio break, stretch. We're really excited to share more of our sample lessons with you. So I'll turn it over to Maureen for an elementary lesson.
All right. Just before I get started, I just wanted to see, can I get a show of hands if there's anybody here from elementary? And I don't see any hands. All right. Totally okay. It's great to see where these lessons can start, right? Because we all know ethnic studies should start at elementary level, right? And a lot of times it doesn't. And so this is one way that you can see how we can integrate it into every level. So this lesson plan is called Exploring the Experiences of Vietnamese Refugees. It is from our second unit stories, and it's tailored towards grades 2 to 4. Now, you can always customize it to go higher or even lower, just depending on what you need for your classroom. So next slide, please. So just a quick run through of the lesson objectives here. Scholars will explore Vietnamese families' refugee experience while developing respect and empathy through listening and discussion. Scholars will determine the difference between immigrants and refugees, and scholars will identify obstacles Southeast Asian refugees face in the US and how they are advocating for themselves today. And I know oftentimes in elementary school, educators always feel like they're not sure how to integrate ethnic studies into their day. Oftentimes, they say they're loaded with reading, writing, and math, and how am I going to fit in ethnic studies on top of that? But you really have to be intentional with the read alouds, and I think read alouds are the best way and the easiest way to bring this into your classroom. But being intentional with what you're picking for your read alouds is very important in covering ethnic studies. Right, you can definitely read all kinds of books like Pinkalicious and Splat the Cat. But if you are intentional with the topics that you are choosing, then you can definitely bring in a whole bunch of standards that will be covered. And no matter if it's in your curriculum or not, you're bringing in reading standards, writing standards, as you can see on this slide. And on the following slide, there's also speaking and listening standards and history and social studies standards that can be all, it's all interdisciplinary. So bringing all these standards into this one lesson goes to show that you can definitely bring this into your classroom, even at the elementary level. Next slide, there we go. So just to introduce the book, it's called A Different Pond, but you would tell your class that, this is a book about a Vietnamese boy and his family. And in this story, we're going to learn about why this family moved to the United States. And before you begin the story, you want to give them a thinking question. So I'm going to ask this of you. If you can put this in the chats, we're just going to pretend like you're in my second grade class right now. But why might some people move from their home countries to go to a different country? And if you could just jot that down in the chats. Yep. War. And this is definitely where the kids already, they construct the meaning themselves and they are describing certain words. But like, for example, Samia just put in the chat war. And that's when you can bring up certain words like, okay, I'm going to name that. You just talked about people leaving their country because of war. That's called being a refugee, right? That's so elevating their language and using what people say and naming it is really important in the elementary classroom. I see other things, new opportunities. They were hurt or chased in their own country. They work and learn a new language to have a better life, right? So a lot of these answers you can take and then help them name it. So then this is when you can bring in vocabulary like immigrants and refugees. Also, on the bottom of that slide, one thing we always want to do too in elementary is make sure that they have a sentence starter so that they know how to start their sentence. So giving that can help your EL learners, but actually all learners in your classroom. Thank you for those answers in the chat. So just explaining a little bit more about refugees, definitely you would name it as they are constructing that definition, but also you would want to teach it explicitly as well. So this is just a slide showing about what refugees or who refugees are and why they are forced to come here. And while you're reading your book, there are definitely certain places where you can stop and discuss. We always want to check for understanding when we're reading a book to the students. So these are just some different examples where you can stop and discuss different parts of the story. I wish I could read it to you because it is a great story called A Different Pond. But just one of the places where you can stop, like if you look at number 3 there, the narrator asks his dad why they still have to fish for food, even though he has 2 jobs already. And his dad says, everything in America costs a lot of money. And the boy feels the calluses on his hand when he squeezes mine. So a thinking question for the class could be, what does his dad's response tell us about their experience in the US? So encouraging that discussion and making sure that they're listening and learning from each other is really important when we're bringing this read aloud into the classroom. At the end of the read aloud, you always want to make sure that you have a closing question or a way to close up the conversation and the discussion. So one of the questions you could ask are, what are some challenges and successes the narrator and his family face as refugees and newcomers to this country? And again, a sentence starter so that you can have your students start their answers. Or some challenges and successes are. So this is a way to assess and really close up the lesson about the story. But you can assess the students by listening to their conversations and listening to see if they're using the vocabulary that was brought up, such as immigrant, refugees, and things like that. So that's a way that you could end the story. And then in an elementary classroom, again, weaving in the reading standards, this is a way to bring in the text to self connection. So asking them, how is your family the same and different as the family in the story? So really relating them back to the story, having them think of themselves, and then comparing and contrasting. And commonly used in elementary school, we have the Venn diagram for as a graphic organizer. So this could also be another point of assessment for that lesson. And then the following day, as a continuation, this is where you would go into the history of what the storybook was talking about. So discussing the obstacles that refugees face in the US would be part 2. And again, you could start with this question, what do you think are some obstacles that they are facing now? So that's okay, next slide. Another great entry point into discussing this in an elementary classroom is using pictures. So for this activity, you would have them take a look at the photo and just write down their noticings. And if you can, Tracy, if you can click on that Padlet, I'm gonna put the link for this Padlet in the chat. One great way to show everybody's thinking is to use a Padlet. So if you look at this Padlet, you can click on this picture here. But if you click on the pink plus button on the very bottom, you could add your thinking onto this Padlet. And this is a great way for you to jot down what everybody's thinking and share what everybody's thinking, and everybody could see what everybody else is thinking about that picture. But if you could all just go ahead and put a noticing down quickly, trying to make this a little interactive here. Write down what you notice, what you feel, or what you think is happening in the picture. This is similar to a Jamboard, but the thing I like about Padlets is you can also add pictures and different things like that, GIFs. Yeah. Exhausted families, lots of people escaping. I see young kids, it seems crowded. I also wonder if it's cold. Yes, and as you can see, it's live, so everybody can see what others' noticings are. So this is a great way to start diving into the rest of the lesson here. How do they sleep and eat? Great question. Okay, and we can go back, Tracy, to the slides. Thank you for sharing some of your noticings there. So moving on, using that Padlet for discussion, there's another video here that the students could watch. It's a quick one, it's only 3 minutes, but it shares experiences of Vietnamese refugees and them looking back at their experience. And again, some questions that you could use are, what are some common feelings and experiences they had? What are some ways that we can help refugees when they arrive here? So really stopping and helping kids think critically about, like, now what's happening now? How can we help the refugees who are here now? And then depending on what grade level you were at, there is an article that is here, and having them think forward into, like, okay, well, now a lot of these Southeast Asian refugees are facing deportation, and why is that happening? Another opportunity to bring up some important words like deportation, but also why is that happening, even though they've been here for many years, and what do you think and feel about this decision? So this could be a journal, this could be a chart, but another way to keep talking about this topic. And for your younger kids, if journal writing is not where they're at, if they're beginning writers, then you can always show them a picture. Here's another video about what's happening right now in the Southeast Asian community and how they're demanding their rights. So this is another way that you can make sure that you teach more explicitly about what's happening. And then ending that lesson, I always like to end with a community circle where students can just share their thoughts about what they learned, about any questions that they have, but the most important part about, I think, sharing this lesson is, teaching the kids that refugees, they want freedom, and most importantly, they want safety. And it's something that a lot of leaders and adults ignore. And I think it's important that we tell our kids and we have them think about, like, why is it so hard for these refugees when they get here, and what is in their way? What are the obstacles, and why do they have to make such a big call for change? Why is it so necessary, and why are they having to fight for that? But the following slide has some extensions, and one thing we do need to do is make sure that we emphasize joy, right? So there's different extensions here that you could do with this activity. So one could be research what your school or community is doing to support refugees in your community. Another one could be like exploring your family's immigration story or another family's story, but also making sure that we talk about the refugee experience, but also emphasizing the joy of that experience as well. And then lastly, some other books that you could use in your classroom. There are many different stories now about refugees and immigration. The first book, A Map into the World, is a Hmong story. Sugar and Milk is a Persian story. And then When Lola Visits is the one that I brought up earlier, Filipino story. And then Wishes is another Vietnamese experience. But this is just one example of how we can bring that ethnic studies lens and into our elementary classroom.
Thanks, Maureen. As a former kindergarten teacher, it is not, it's not, if our kids can experience racism, if our kids can experience discrimination, they may not have these particular, the particular vocabulary to explain it, but they can definitely explain how they feel, right? And so this is really part of acknowledging what our students experience, and of course, hopefully changing that trajectory for them moving forward. Yes, I love the extensions and the emphasis on joy, because again, we're thinking about like the cultural wealth, right? Like how do we affirm students' identity? All of the things that they bring to, to the classroom, especially at an early age. It's too easy to dim their lights as soon as they get to school. And unfortunately, many of us have seen it happen or experienced it ourselves. So now we're moving on to, thank you so much, Maureen, a secondary lesson, and I will turn it over to Danny.
Thank you, Tracy. I think it would behoove me to mention that my partner in creating this lesson is Eunice, and a big shout out to Eunice. So this is Decolonizing the Pacific Islands. It's part of social movements in our AAPI chapter. And just a little background information, in the AAPI world and realm, I've seen statistics of Pacific Islanders making up 1%. And to come up with this lesson was just a joy. And the reason is because it is rare that I ever had an opportunity to learn about me and my people. And so that was to work with Eunice on this was quite a joyous experience. And so to the next slide, please. I think I have a link in the... Yes, this is it. Awesome. Okay. So it's about 5 to 6 days for this particular lesson, and it's about 6 different activities. And the key thing, the purpose for this lesson is for our students to become familiar with colonization in the Pacific Islands, in addition to the effects of colonizations on different areas of indigenous ways of life. And one of the most important part of this particular lesson is identifying the 7 pillars of colonization in the Pacific Island. And the enduring understanding for this particular lesson is that the students will be able to critically identify the impacts of colonization on indigenous ways of life in the Pacific Islands. And so the ethnic studies principles that are being highlighted in this particular lesson is celebrating and honoring Native peoples of the land and communities of color by providing a space to share their stories of struggle and resistance, and by connecting ourselves to past and contemporary resistance movement that struggle for social justice to ensure a truer democracy. And next slide, please. In this particular lesson, we front end load with a map and also critical vocabulary. And so if you could go to the chat, and when you hear of Pacific Islands, what do you think of when you hear that phrase? And if you could put that into the chat. Thanks, Terry. Filipino. Thank you. Samoa and Tonga, Moana, complexity, lots of islands. Thank you, Kristen. Thanks, Dolly. Seafarers, that's one that's rarely ever discussed. But yes, seafarers, a long tradition of seafaring and native Hawaiians. Beautiful beaches. With sea level rise, there might not be those beautiful beaches. Red rice and Caliban, thank you, Tracy. My mouth is watering. American tourist, Lupe, thank you. Yeah, and so, you know, there, as I said, 1% of the AAPI community can consist of Pacific Islanders. So, you know, my first thought, you know, was to like consider that there's probably some folks that come into this space that may have little experience around the Pacific Islands, but yes, there are. Thank you for that. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so we had talked about the Pacific Islands being a geographic region, and it's several different names that were applied to this region by European explorers. And so I think it's so very important to interrogate those different terms like Oceania, Micronesia, Polynesia, Melanesia. And so we're going to also offer some new terms for students to consider. Next slide, please. And some of the, so this is how the terms Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia came into existence. It was a French explorer, and these wide, gigantic, large, watery regions of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, which was categorized by this French explorer, he believed that it also made a connection between their ethnic makeup. Next point, that another word is Pacifica. Another term is for Pacific Islanders and islands, and it has an ethnic racial term and to describe the original people, the inhabitants, and diaspora. Next. The World Health Organization estimates there are 6.6 million people that live on the islands in the Pacific, and that was from 2013. And not all Pacific islands have warm tropical climates. If you've ever been to Hawaii, at least the big islands, you will find several there. And in the Hawaiian Islands, there are 5 different climate zones. Next, please. Eastern Island. This is how Easter Island got its name. In 1772, Dutch explorers landed there on Easter Sunday. Next. And the seafaring piece, there has been a long history of Pacific Islanders seafaring, and with some amazing vessels. And in 1975, a group of Hawaiians had an experiment. They built the hokalea, which is an outrigger canoe. And without using any modern methods of navigation, they were able to arrive in Tahiti using the stars, winds, and ocean currents as their only navigation tools. In addition to that, like a few years later, the hokalea was able to navigate around the world. So there is a long history of seafaring for Pacific Islanders. Next. And sweet potatoes. Around 1200 CE, Native Americans and Polynesians were both, they had contact with each other, and that is why sweet potatoes can be found in the Polynesia area and in native lands here in North America. Let's go to the next slide, please. And there's a piece that talking about interrogating these terms and taking the categorizations that colonizers put upon Pacific Islanders. Our Sea of Islands, this is an excerpt, and we are going to have a reading with that and some of the reflection questions for The start of this lesson includes those three. What belittling view do people have of the Pacific Islands, and what historical context? What does the author prefer? Why does the author prefer the term Sea of Islands over islands in the far sea? And about, has this reading challenged your own perception of Pacific Islands and how? Next slide, please. And we're going to offer an actual hands-on experience with mapping. And one of the ways that we can do this is to share the map with our students, and they could use it on their computers, and we can list different islands they could find, or they can go with the terms Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia and determine islands from those particular categories. Next slide, please. And this is a brand new piece that Eunice added, and it's a continuation of the French traveler who arbitrarily created these groupings. And so it's important to note that in the slide. Next slide, please. And vocab front loading. I think it's very important to have students have access and then do some research on these words. And these are the 7 words that we've selected for our Jamboard vocabulary activity. And if you go to the next slide, we could show you what that Jamboard looks like. I will share this Jamboard link with the students. And so they're going to use dictionary.com and thesaurus.com to find a definition in their own words and have a synonym, which are words that are spelled differently, but kind of mean the same thing, using in a meaningful sentence or drawing a picture of it as well. I also allow my students, if they are challenged with illustrating, they could insert a picture. And next slide, please. And what is decolonization? I would like to play some of this video, and then we can move into the next part.
They forbid our language. So our great grandparents, every time they would speak their native language, they would be punished for it.
Hafadayam Ha'ani.
Hafadayam Isaiah.
Hi, I am Shaukwalasi Inina.
Hafadayam Inina Gwahusi Melvin. I'm the Executive Director of the Commission on Decolonization. You know what we're going to talk about today?
Decolonization.
Yeah, that's a good guess. What do you know about colonization?
It's when a bigger country comes and finds another land and they take ownership over it.
It's when another nation moves into a place or they take control over it.
When someone with more power takes over someone with less power.
Colonization is when the large country finds another place that they're interested in. The larger country will come into this place and set up shop. And while they're there, they take advantage of what this new place has to offer and allow that resource to benefit the larger country. How do you think colonization has affected your elders, like your grandparents?
When the Americans came to Guam, they bought a lot of people's land or just took it and gave them almost nothing for sacred land. It affects them in the way that they're losing their home. They're losing places that they've lived for their whole lives.
They weren't granted citizenship until the 1950s, and they weren't able to vote until the 1960s. They were also in Navy and Western schooling when they.
Thank you. So that was one of the videos that to open the colonization part. And if we go to the next slide, we have a graphic organizer. And if you were to, this graphic organizer has 4 different videos of colonization on Guam, colonization in Hawaii, and colonization of Fiji. And so they're going to use this graphic organizer to be an expert and home groups. And since there are 4 different videos, there'll be groups of 4, and each person in the group of 4 would take one of the videos and be an expert and write notes about what they saw and what they learned from the colonization video. And then they would also use the same graphic organizer when they learn about the 7 pillars of colonization. And then this completed graphic organizer will be used in a community circle to have a discussion. And we could go to the next slide. And there's the video 1. Next slide.
When Puerto Rico...
And this is Hawaii. Next slide. It's going to be the colonization of Fiji, and the video 4 is another Fiji video, and the geography of Fiji. And that's going to lead us to activity 4, using the same graphic organizer. To the right of the first column, they're going to then go through colonization and learning the different the 7 pillars. If we can go to the next slide, the first pillar, grabbing the land. And we can move quickly to this. I can see my 15 minutes is about up. Pushing natives out. Growing for the colonizer. Next, developing the colonizer's country. Consuming colonially. Hatching hierarchies. More hatching hierarchies. Killing cultures and languages. And that's an example. And exploiting and abusing the land. So our students are going to have this graphic organizer, and they're going to be able to have discussions about what they learned about each of those islands and instances of colonization and the 7 pillars of colonization, and they're going to take notes of based upon the videos they had saw. And so moving on to activity 5, effects of colonization and creating a infographic. And here's an example of an infographic that students would be able to create, and using the 7 pillars of colonization and using an island, a Pacific island that they became an expert on. This could be a group project or it could be an individual project. And next, and this is our ultimate assessment, and it's a community collaboration Instagram project. Next slide, please. It's a celebration. And this could either be a group project or an individual project. So we have these templates, these Instagram templates, and students will research an organization that works toward decolonization, create an Instagram profile, and highlight and describe what they do, and highlight 3 indigenous practices, cultures, or language that include an image and description. And then next slide is our final closing circle of what they learned. And so these are examples. And that concludes that particular lesson on decolonization of the Pacific Islands.
Thank you, Danny. 1%, right? The statistics are about 1% of our students in California have ancestors in the Pacific Islands. And I think from the very beginning, when you first asked us what do we think of, it'd be interesting, right, to see what is resonating with us now. So, while we transition from Danny's amazing lesson on decolonization to Samia's lesson on Arab Americans, folks, if you can think about what's resonating with you now about the Pacific Islands, what you think of when you think about Pacific Islands. I'll also say this, I appreciate how, Danny and Eunice, how you incorporated so many different aspects and modalities. There's evidence of, building community, there's evidence of social emotional learning, the aspect of using, technology, like technology integration. And a lot of times we get this, the accusation of ethnic studies not being rigorous. Well, I don't think that I think that with all of the lessons you've seen so far, that is definitely not the case. Students are thinking critically every step of the way. So thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, Samia.
Thank you. So thank you, Danny and Maureen and Eunice, for all of the lessons that you have shared. I know I was chatting away with a colleague that I work with. I'm like, oh my gosh, we can incorporate all of these. And I'm excited to be here to talk about a lesson around who Arab Americans are, centering on identity and stories. It's chapter 4 of the Asian American Pacific Islander unit. Arab Americans have historically been a big part of the Asian American, usually departments in most universities, unless you're San Francisco State and you have your own Arab American ethnicities and diasporas program. I want to really quickly share. You can see this picture on the slide. Those are my own kids. So I am in this as an ethnic studies educator, but also as a mother whose kids are growing up and will be in middle school next year, hoping they start to see ethnic studies in their middle school experience. We didn't get it in our elementary experience, unfortunately, and definitely I know for sure in their high school experience. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to quickly kind of go over, some of the outcomes. I'm going to go quick, the lesson objectives, but hopefully you'll experience part of a lesson focused on Arab Americans as an example of how to infuse us in ethnic studies, humanities, social science, and then have an opportunity to share some ideas, resources, and experiences. Go to the next slide. There's a slide there around lesson objectives that you can use with students. And really thinking about this question, what influences our identities and then in turn our stories, and that can be applicable to all students. And then thinking about the question we'll focus on today, which is how can historical, economic, political, and social events or moments influence our identities and shape our personal stories? And you can go back and think about what Maureen's lesson shared in the photos. You can think about what Eunice talked about, what Danny talked about, and how that question can really encompass, right, or move over all of those lessons. But we can move on. Part of Liberated Schools is to kind of think about what the guiding principles and where the alignment is. So those are there as well. And you're going to have access to all these slides. That's why I'm going quickly. I'm hoping to save most of our time to actually get into some of the lesson. So you can go to the next slide. There's standards alignment there. And then let's get into it. So what I'd like to do is if someone can share the link to that Jamboard in the chat, I'd like you to think about a time you have felt included or excluded in school and or society based on who you are. I have one real example there. You can look at the slide, the picture or the post on that slide. If you can go back to the actual slide really quick. So this was an Instagram post. You can see a picture of a girl in a t-shirt. That girl was a 6th grader. This happened just a few months ago. It says, last fall, my 6th grader daughter eagerly returned to school after 2 years of virtual schooling. 3 weeks in, she was pulled from her classroom and reprimanded by the school counselor. Why? Because she was wearing a t-shirt that said Free Palestine in English and the word Palestine in Arabic over a map of historic Palestine. Her father made the t-shirt and she was excited to wear it. According to the school counselor, her shirt promoted violence and was a threat to the safety of students. The parent was called to pick up the daughter. This happened in a school district here around the Bay Area. So yes, progressive, Bay Area. So I want you to think about this post and think about it, your own life or your own kids or a relative or any of your own students, and think about a time where you have felt included or excluded in school and or society. So take a minute. You can just click on the little Post-it notes there and type in an example. Share those. Can you refresh, Tracy? And then we'll see if things are popping up. There we go. Growing up in the late 90s, I never saw myself in the history curriculum or read anything by AAPI authors. Today, it's so exciting to see TV shows, movies, etc. Representation matters. Amen, for sure. Excluded 99% of my K-12 experience, low expectations, no college courses. All my friends had college prep. Coworkers frequently confuse me for other Asian women on campus. They never apologize or indicate commitment to change. It makes me feel insignificant. Invisible. As a Chicana, almost, let me just share these two more. All curriculum excludes us. As a Chicana in solidarity with Palestine, there's a real attempt to force my exclusion. Ooh, we're going to talk about the exclusion when you align yourself, with Palestine. Thank you. The new wave of AAPI representation in Hollywood, superhero movies, TV shows definitely made me emotional. Yeah, we're starting to see a shift finally, right? And we want to make sure that that shift isn't just like one or two, but lots, right? In the numbers that we see all different people represented positively. That's a good one. I'm really old, so when the principal pulled me out of class and told me to go home and change because I was wearing pants. Ooh, yeah, right? All of those pieces, right? We have so many pieces to our identities, not just race and ethnicity, all of it, whether it's gender, the way we decide to identify. So we can go back to the slides. You'll have students kind of, right? You can use this post or another, have them start to think about when they felt included and excluded. And you can even do a T-chart, right? And have them do both and then analyze for themes, right? What themes are popping out around where people feel included and where they feel excluded? And you could do society and or school and try to pick out those things. So then what you would do is you can go to the next slide is I have a series of quotes and you'll present students with these different quotes and have them identify when students felt included or excluded in school and or society. So there's one there. I'd like to go to the next slide and ask a few people to maybe unmute and just read these. There's 6. So if I could get 6 different people, maybe someone can just start with one, just unmute and read it out into the space.
I've been defending my people and culture since I started school. I found that I always have to fact check my teachers, especially my history teachers.
Thank you. Someone else for the second one?
I have been made fun of for being Arab and Muslim. I have been called a terrorist, a camel rider, and oppressed.
Third one?
Students would drop pencils near us and yell, "Boom, it's a bomb." My history teacher repeatedly asked if he could call me Middle East because my name is too hard to pronounce.
Teachers expect me to comment when they teach about Arabs and Muslims.
Thank you.
I am always dismissed as an angry Middle Eastern kid who is overly emotional when it comes to discussing issues that relate to me.
When the New Zealand shooting happened, my family was scared to go to the masjid. We were worried racists would target mosques.
So these are all quotes from Arab youth here around the Bay Area. Taraf means truth. It was a report put out by the Arab Resource and Organizing Center in 2020, so just a couple years ago. You can have students, right, analyzing and thinking about where youth are feeling, again, included or excluded at school or in society. I think, Eunice talked about this frame of Orientalism. And if you don't know, Edward Said, who is a famous Palestinian professor of literature, wrote the book Orientalism in 1978 to address, right, to kind of create this framework around Orientalism and what people think is the Middle East, right? What people think about this Arab world. And, you know, the term, right, Asian American that propped up in the late 1960s also coincided with when Arab Americans started organizing and organizations started popping up in this country. So you can go to the next slide. Again, another quote talking about, right, a lot of people put things about representation on the Jamboard, and really thinking about how students feel and really this idea of representation and why it matters. Just going to use that, right, as an into activity to kind of think about how these things start to influence our identities and stories. So next slide. And then you can kind of work and have students think about, right, these questions and have them, right, you can use the Jamboard and quote activity to kind of connect how inclusion and exclusion often influences our identity formation, especially among youth, right? I think about the way my own kids are forming their identities in this country and what they're exposed to and the way I did. I'm a daughter of immigrant parents who immigrated from Palestine, one of 7 who did not see myself in school. And because I didn't see myself in school, or I saw the negative stuff, I was in high school during the Gulf War, and the way the media portrayed us, I ran away from that and had left myself at home while I just attended to trying to fit in at school. So you can show this video. I will ask Tracy to just play a little clip, and what students will do is think about how historical, economic, and political moments, right, influence our identities, whether we want them to or not. And this is one video. You can play others, but let's just watch a little bit of this one.
From Brooklyn to Air Hamas.
I want to read this piece tonight for my brothers, Samih and Omar Hamad. It is a revision of first writing since. There have been no words, no poetry in ashes south of Canal, no prose in trucks driving debris and DNA. Evident out my window in abstract reality, sky where once was steel, smoke where once was flesh. Please, God, let it be a mistake, the pilot's heart, the plane's engine. God, please, don't let it be anyone who looks like my brothers. I don't know how bad a life has to break in order to kill. I've never been so hungry that I willed hunger. Never so angry as to want a gun over a pen. Not really. Even as a woman, a Palestinian, never this broken. Ricardo on radio said in his accent thick as yucca, I will feel so much better when the first bombs drop over there. A woman crying in a car parked and stranded and hurt, I offered comfort, a hand she did not see before she said, we're gonna burn them so bad. My hand went to my head, and my head to the dead Iraqi children, the dead in Nicaragua, in Rwanda, who vied with fake sport wrestling for America's attention. People saying this was bound to happen. Let's not forget U.S. transgressions. Hold up, I live here. These are my friends and fam, me in those buildings, and we're not bad people. Do not support America's bullying. Can I just have half a second to feel bad? Thank you, woman, who saw me drinking cool and blinking tears, opened her arms before she asked, do you want a hug? Big white woman, and her embrace only people with flesh can offer. My brothers in the Navy, I said, and we're Arabs. Wow, you got double trouble. Word. One more person asked me if I knew the hijackers. One more motherfucker asked me what Navy my brother is in. One more person assumed no Arabs or Muslims were killed. Assume they know me, or that I represent a people, or that a people represent.
So you can show a piece. Obviously, there's another version. You can censor the bad word, but we're all adults here. So then you'd ask students, right, to break down and kind of debrief. So you can go to the next slide. But let's think about this. How is this poet talking about the influences on her and her family members' identities and by what happened? So if you didn't figure it out, right, she's talking about 9/11. But what are some things? You can unmute, you can chat. What is the poet sharing about influences on her and her family members' identities and others?
That she considers herself and her family as part of both cultures, both Arab and American.
Yeah, thank you. I see someone unjust grouping. Yep, blanket, right? Blanket grouping or blaming. What else?
I think it's really sad that she has to tell people that her brother is in the Navy. And even worse, that they ask what Navy, have to defend her American side, and classify her or categorize her instead of, seeing the pain that she's going through as any human did at that time.
Totally, that piece around racialization and defending your Americanness. And I'm going to share something in a minute and, and I want you to think about this racialization that happened post 9/11 to Arabs, to Muslims, to people that weren't even Arab or Muslim, right? A lot of, right, Indian, Sikh people being racialized because of what they looked like and blamed and targets of violence. But that, right, unfolds a lot of pieces of discussion for students that you can really kind of organize around. How many of our students, how many of us have been asked where we're from when where we are from is here, right? Born and raised. You can move to the next slide. There's lots of examples. So she's Palestinian, she talks about 9/11, but, and these are live links when you get the slides, but you can analyze these pictures on the left. What's happening in Yemen? What's happening in Syria still today? And think about, we have Yemeni and Syrian refugees in our class. We have people just of Yemeni and Syrian descent who are very connected to their home countries, and what's happening and how is what is happening there influencing their identities. So those are other examples you can use. You can move to the next slide. Sorry, I'm rushing. I'm looking at time. But then once you do all those, right, having students think about this quote. Is there someone that can read this quote into the space?
Human beings make their own history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. Our identities, i.e. our stories, are historical political constructs, but this does not make the effective history that constitutes our being something we use and put away. We live as human beings in and as the story identity that we are.
Thank you, Lupe. Right, so that's Tiseni Sarabican, and thinking about sometimes who we choose to be or how we identify ourselves. One, it's ever changing, right? And it can ever change depending on what's happening, because some of what's happening to us or our countries or our places or our people are not things that we control, right? And we saw that in some of the examples given in the earlier lessons. So I want to move from there to kind of a second part. And I would say you can kind of flip these parts of the lesson depending on if you're doing a unit based or teaching ethnic studies based on kind of the different groups, or if you're teaching it thematically. But let's see, let's test your knowledge. I'll have you chat in first. How many, so you can do like 1 and give me a number. How many Arab Americans you think live in the United States? And then 2, which state in the United States has the largest Arab American population? All right, so let's try. I see 8 million in Michigan, California, and Michigan. What else do you got? How many people? And then 5 million, getting closer, California. Okay. Any other guesses? Number 2, Michigan, very close. See, California and Michigan, and some kind of close on the number. Minnesota, okay. Minnesota, let's go 4.5 million. Okay, getting pretty close. Let's go. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to show you the answers really quickly, but it's kind of fun. So there's the census estimated Arab American population. The AAI is the Arab American Institute. There's a link there for the source with the adjusted population. I'm about to talk about why that it's almost double. And you're right, California and Michigan. California, because it's way bigger and has a bigger population than Michigan. There's a lot of us here. Michigan does have the highest concentration in one city, which is Dearborn. You can go to the next slide. This shows you kind of where the Arab populations are from, or their kind of background. You can go to the next slide. This is another place, right, where you can ask kids, like, what does being Arab mean, right? It means that you come from an Arab-speaking country, which spans what is, defined as, the Middle East, North Africa. And then earlier I saw someone in the chat say, like, do Arabs consider themselves Asians? Well, you can see all the countries basically right to the right of where North Africa is fall right in the continent of Asia. So then you can move on. You can kind of talk about the first Arabs in the United States. You can go to the next slide and kind of the waves of Arab immigration, right? So kind of Arab involuntary immigration started with Arabs being brought to the United States as slaves. And then the first waves of kind of Lebanese and Syrian Arabs coming in between the 1800s and 1920s, and then with the 50s and 60s, and after the 70s you see more predominantly kind of in the 60s, and after the 70s more Palestinian immigrants, and then lately a lot of Yemeni and Syrians because of what's happening. But there's a whole kind of mini lecture that goes along with that piece. But I want to go back to kind of the census number and that piece on racialization, so you can kind of talk about, right, the way that Arabs are counted, which we are counted as white. So when we are filling out the US Census, we do direct people to choose other so that there is a closer count, but it literally will give you directions to say, and here's the directions, right? The category white includes all individuals who identify with one or more nationalities or ethnic groups originating in Europe, Middle East, North Africa, examples, and then it gives all the examples. So I think you all probably know this too if you work in schools. When schools talk about BIPOC students, they might include Arab students, Palestinian students, Egyptian students, Lebanese students, but you're not counting them like in your student information system. So like your ARIES or your Schoology or whatever power school you're using, right, doesn't necessarily count. Yes, I see. And I see, Kristen, thank you for that, right? You've always felt that even though I'm third generation American, but grandparents came from Syria, it's like, I'm born and raised here. And so we are, all of us that live here are American, but there's not a way to kind of count who we are in schools, unless you look at families when they fill out their paper and they say maybe they're Arab origin. So we can go through, there's some resources there. If you go to the next slide that talks about that, this is a great little narrated video by Lada. And then there's some kind of people talking about, right? It's very interesting that when they want to racialize us, when something happens, it's so easy to racialize Arabs or Arabs and Muslims. And then it's so easy to not, right, when we are being counted. So there's this big kind of tension in identity and being seen as a group. Even more why ethnic studies is a place, right, for Arab Americans to find a home. Next slide. And, again, this is a pretty good piece on Mo Amer, still talking, about being Arab and Palestinian and why, right? And then kind of what that has done. Following this slide, you can go to the next one, are some questions about Arab American identities, and then asks a question, around similar experiences. And you can go to the next slide. So the next few are different pieces for students to analyze. And somebody brought up something on the Jamboard earlier around Palestine. And so I want to talk about Palestine as an exception, because sometimes it seems easier, right? If you're Lebanese or Egyptian or Syrian, people don't question as much until you say you're Palestinian. This is Gigi and Bella Hadid, whose father is Palestinian. They shared this on, one of them shared it on Instagram. It was censored. There's the source in the story there. Because fame doesn't mean that you're not subject to this erasure of your identity. You can go to the next slide. A couple more examples, again, one from Gigi, and then this piece from Rami Malek that was in Vogue, in him talking about, like, I never really thought about my identity or who I was, even though I'm the son of immigrants from Egypt. And so he kind of talks about in the article, right, really thinking about, I wonder if I thought about this earlier, how it might have influenced me. You can go to the next slide. Another example, Ade Abushi, who is an NFL football player on the left. You see him identified as an American football player, right? And then how he identifies himself. Again, it's okay to racialize when it's kind of negative racialization, but then when it's something positive, they leave it out. And then you can go to the next slide. Because here are some starting to look at some pieces of like what's happening in these examples, right? How are Arabs being included or excluded? How do you think this influences their identities and stories? And then what intersections can we see with other communities? And I put these in here for you all, but there's also some other images you can use, but you can see, right? Palestine to the Philippines. You can see this image that was drawn by an Arab artist around defending Black life, linking Palestinian and Latinx communities, right? And Ferguson and what's happening in Palestine. So really thinking about like all of these pieces that influence our stories and then the intersections we can draw to other communities. And then the last couple of slides are just some resources. And if we had more time, we could have talked about like where to put, to share some things. There's an assessment right there, and then how you can draw it back to Arab Americans. And then there's an ending slide really to get back to that stories piece. There's a few slides with resources. We can skip those, but I'd like to just in the last few minutes we have kind of end with this piece around conclusive dialogue and really think about what are your takeaways from today? We can go to the next slide. How did you see resistance and joy highlighted in today's lessons? And how will you use an authentic studies lens, an authentic ethnic studies lens when designing learning experiences? Would love people to chat. Would really love if anyone wants to unmute and talk about maybe something new they learned or something you're taking away that you're excited to try or incorporate.
Well, I'm looking at possibly changing my textbook now after these lessons because it doesn't adequately address everything that you've shared. So I'm going to be looking at a textbook that is better at covering Asian and Arab experiences.
That's awesome. Thank you. I see opportunity to learn. Thank you for being here, Dennis. Decolonization is a practice of self-love, joy, resistance, and community love. Thank you, Eunice. Others.
I wasn't aware of the history, and I appreciated that the first activity had to do with the history of just the term AAPI, and it is definitely something that, as covering different parts of the United States and trying to put in context of when and how the history of that comes about, but then to tie it into something that you just mentioned, the history of the census in relationship to that. seems like an exciting area to try to go and find some interesting documents for the kids to look at.
Yeah, thanks for drawing that connection. Thanks, Jackie. Love the emphasis on joy in action, highlighting and centering the stories of our ancestors and our scholars. And thank you. Thank you for being here. Allowing students to see, hear, and recognize leaders in their cultures, for sure. The framing, learned so much. Thank you all, and we're sorry we only shared snippets, but we wanted to give you a feel of different lessons that will be included and available for your use in classes. Tracy, can I hand it back to you to close us?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Samia. And all of our teachers here who have presented on their lessons. This is just a work of heart that we engage in. I mean, all of us have had long days or just finishing up our school years or this was our first day of rest as we closed out the summer. And so I do want to thank you all for joining us today. As always, as reflective people, we want to make sure that we get input and feedback on the sessions and workshops that we as Liberated Ethnic Studies provide. So in the chat, there is an evaluation form. We would love to get your feedback. And yes, we will send out these slides for you to, we will put, Eunice, do you mind putting the slides in the chat? And we'll also send
Actually, I think those who do the evaluation should get the slides. That'll be a way that we ensure we get the evaluation. Would that be okay?
Yes, so exit ticket, please fill out the form. Seriously, it really is an opportunity for us to continue to learn and to grow and also see what other lessons that you would like to see. So I'm not sure if that a particular question is in the form, but if there are other lessons or pieces of information that you would want to see, then please put that in the chat and we will work on it or maybe help you, support you with creating these lessons as well. This is all of our contact information. So if you have any questions for any of us, again, these will be in the slides, but if you want to just take note of that contact information, we are here to support you. So see a question, we'll be able to get an attendance verification as well. Yes, Lupe, I think we'll be able to share that out.
Yeah, email us at the liberatedethnicstudies@gmail.com and we will create a verification for you. You just have to give us a couple days, but you'll get one for sure.
Okay. So in the last minute that we have left, were there any lingering questions that folks had? Feel free to unmute. And of course, you can contact us. Thank you, Lupe, for putting the email on the chat. Oh, I think we're missing a D, liberatedethnicstudies@gmail.com.
Thank you for sharing about the cultures I feel are not represented in a lot of ethnic studies courses.
Yeah. Well, we are glad that you made it. And if we could all unmute and, give ourselves a hand. Thank you so much to our presenters, our curriculum writers this evening. Our students are definitely blessed by all of these folks. And our mission is to support folks with their ethnic studies, right? Their ethnic studies lessons, spreading ethnic studies, because, it has to start early. And if your districts want any more information or you believe that, your districts might need or schools might need guidance, we are also here for you. Anything else that my team wants to add?
I'm not sure if you are a part of the ethnic studies micro-credentials, but I felt like they were really emphasized on African-American or Latino culture. So I think it would be super beneficial if you were in San Diego Unified's micro-credential to share about the other represented ethnicities.
Well, you have two folks from San Diego Unified that are here, and we'll take that information back to the big committee. So thank you for that input. All right, so it's 7:31. We're a minute over. Again, thank you so much for your time.